In the now infinite ocean of platformers, it's honestly very easy to miss a great series or forget it even existed, especially when said series barely got localized at all. Well, let's cut to the chase. You know it, I know it. Today, we're talking about the Starfy games, a series of platformers boasting some of the best gameplay that are practically never talked about. Hello everyone, this is the RPG Monger, and in this video, not only will I dive into the one localized Starfy game I played a ton as a kid, but also the other four people barely know about. So alright, to kick things off, let's go back to the 90s, as while the first Starfy game would only come out in 2002, its development would be kind of a nightmare. Conceived all the way back in 1995 when Nintendo producer Hitoshi Yamagami's boss tasked him with creating a game under the broad concept of a floaty platformer. Originally, Starfy was going to be a balloon pushing game for the Game Boy, with Tosei producer Yasuhiro Minamimoto coming on board the project. While the floaty aspect of the game would remain, the project would go through an extensive planning phase, at one point even replacing the balloon concept with Nintendo characters inside bubbles. Thankfully though, as the initial prototype was, to quote the developer, an annoying game that wasn't any fun at all, the small team would ship the concept to a water-based game, with an actual character doing the floating this time. In fact, at this stage, Starfy almost ended up as a jellyfish, the team eventually settling on a starfish. And on a side note, because Starfy falls from the sky at the beginning of the game, it'd become Tosei policy to say Starfy is neither a starfish or a star when asked. But anyways, with that hurdle taken care of, up until 1998, development for the Game Boy game would progress pretty smoothly. The only problem was, by 1998, the Game Boy had been out for 9 years, with a new and improved Game Boy Color on the horizon. As a result, with the game's development still having a ways to go, and pressure from Nintendo to make the game for the Game Boy Color instead, all development would have to be reworked for the new handheld, which honestly was definitely for the better, as this time Starfy would come far closer to being realized, nearing the end of development and being promoted, a trailer for the game even being shown at Space World 2000 alongside many highly anticipated titles. Except hold on, wasn't Space World 2000 the same trade show that featured the Game Boy Color successor? That definitely doesn't bode well, and well, just like before, as the Game Boy Color came and went, Starfy's Game Boy Color game would have to be cancelled, development yet again being reworked for the Game Boy Advance. But thankfully, the devs wouldn't let another handheld pass them by, as finally on September 6, 2002, Densetsu no Starfy, or the Legendary Starfy, would release. Except when it did release, unlike many larger Nintendo projects, it'd only be in Japan, any localization to other regions being cancelled. And let me tell you, the reason for this is probably the most depressing thing you'll hear all day, as despite the creators wanting to release the game overseas, Nintendo of America deemed the title to be, and I quote, too Japanese, which is just dumbfounding on so many levels. Like hell, now 12 years after this game was released, fans actually cobbled together a near complete translation of the game, and having played through it all the way now, I understood things just fine. Sure, there are occasional references to Japanese culture, like a sumo wrestler character or an octopus whose head looks like takoyaki, but it's not enough to keep an entire game from getting localized. It makes me sad, man. I guarantee you, had the games been made now, they'd definitely be localized without second thought. But for the sake of the video, let's not dwell on it, as after such an elongated development cycle, how would the final product fare? Well, all around pretty great in my opinion. The way I see it, the first Starfy game is more like a proof of concept, paving the way for the future games in the series. Since all around, it's a pretty short game, only taking around 3 hours to complete the main story. Though where the game lacks in length, it fully makes up for in gameplay, because Starfy's varied platforming is some of the most fun I've ever had with a platformer. On the ground, it's about what you'd expect, Starfy being able to dash, jump, and use a spin attack, but in the water, it's entirely different, Starfy being able to swim pretty fast and even spin dash to attack or go faster. As far as platformers go, it definitely features the most fluid water levels I've ever played, Starfy being able to speed through water sections with ease. And when you combine those two gameplay styles, it creates a unique gameplay experience, jumping in and out of the water all the while trying to keep up your momentum. Plus, with the combat in the game, while none of the bosses are particularly challenging, they are fun, taking full advantage of the aquatic combat. But all of this is only part of what sets Starfy aside from its peers, as rather than just progressing through stages all the way until the end, this game features more of a quest-based progression system, each level having its own cast of characters Starfy has to help out to move on to the next level. It's something I personally enjoyed a lot, and it gives the game a whole lot more personality. And aside from the core gameplay, for such a short game, Starfy has a good amount of things to do, from collecting all the treasure in new areas unlocked by beating the game once, trying out an assortment of vehicles, and unlocking side content like the picture book, where each enemy and character gets a little description. To name my personal favorite, I love how as you get closer to completing the game, this big group photo slowly gets filled out with the characters you meet. Yet another thing that gives Starfy loads of personality. Though now that we've covered all there is gameplay-wise, let's talk story. Of course, what with Starfy 1 being so short, its story is about equal in length, but still pretty important all the same, as it essentially sets up the stories for the next two games as well. Basically, high in the sky above the ocean, there's this floating kingdom called the Puff Top, where our protagonist Starfy lives out his days as the prince of the kingdom. The only problem is, he's incredibly clumsy, accidentally knocking a pot into the ocean that released a long-imprisoned demon named Ogura. Once free, to exact revenge on the place he was imprisoned for so long, he'd create a storm to ravage the kingdom, throwing Starfy off of it and into the ocean below. In turn, after being helped out by a kind lobster and becoming friends with a reliable treasure-hungry clam named Mo, Starfy begins his journey to stop Ogura, helping many different characters along the way until finally reaching Ogura and defeating him. But that's not all, as aside from the main story, Starfy, much like another Nintendo platformer, has its own lore. Yep, you heard me right, except rather than packing it into pause screens like Kirby would begin doing in a couple years, Starfy sneaks it into the staff credits, more specifically the second version of them that plays once you've 100%ed the game. In the first game, the second credits fleshes out some of Mo's backstory, revealing that the clam wasn't just being greedy when it came to searching for treasure, he only did it because back at his dilapidated house, he has to raise his 3 younger siblings all on his own, barely able to provide for their needs. Thankfully though, once you've collected all the treasure in the game, Mo is able to buy food, a teddy bear, and a Game Boy Advance for his younger siblings, showing just how good-natured he's been all along. And just you wait, because if you think that's sad, it only gets worse in later games. So there you have it. As unfortunately the only Starfy game fans have translated as of now, it's a fun little experience that I recommend to anyone who's a fan of the series. However now, with the first game covered, let's move on to the next game, like the first, only released in Japan. The Legendary Star Fe2, released only a year after the first game, does everything a sequel should, greatly expanding on what the first game established. For one, the game is over double the length of the original, now having many more levels per world rather than each world only having 1 level. Plus, compared to the first Starfy's 9 worlds, this game has 11, increasing the overall content of the game massively. And that's not all, as for Starfy himself, the second game would give him new abilities like a double jump, ducking and sliding, and the shooting star, all the while retaining everything from the original. Just like the first Starfy, it's a genuinely fun game, its structure continuing to surround helping out characters throughout the different levels. Although I will say, with no fan translation for this or the rest of the Japanese Starfy games, much of the gameplay experience was kinda just me guessing at what's happening. Please, if any of you watching have the capability to, you've gotta translate the rest of these games. I'm begging you. However, what didn't need translating for me to understand was the addition of stuff. A little piece of side content where you can dress up Starfy in the things you've gotten throughout the game, the feature becoming a staple in all Starfy games to come. And man, I had way too much fun with this, sometimes forgetting the outfit I gave Starfy and being surprised whenever it showed up on the pause screen. Plus, like before, the other bits of side content like mini-games, photos, and the picture book make a return, with the photos this time being of each character rather than just a big group photo. Though what with the game's length being much longer now, what would the story of this Starfy game be? Well, continuing off of the events of the first game, the game starts off with Ogura again, this time his pot locked inside a room so Starfy can't screw things up. Anyways, as Ogura spent another day trapped in the jar, annoyed by Starfy and his parents, he came up with a plan for his escape, taking 2 orbs out of his nose and turning them into children, 10 to be exact. Immediately after, ordering his snot kids to escape the jar and cause a storm to release him, as they were small enough to get out. For brevity's sake, we'll call them the Petite Oguras from now on. In turn, once Ogura escaped again, to exact revenge on Starfy for defeating him previously, he kidnapped Starfy's mother, the Queen of Puff Top. Seeing this, Starfy enters a state of panic, chasing after Ogura and falling off Puff Top into the ocean yet again, taking an unwilling Mo with him. Like I already said, from here the game progresses much like the last one, Starfy helping out characters and fighting one of the Petite Ogura at the end of each stage. My personal favorites being a tie between the one who straight up rides a bike underwater and the one with a pompadour. So then, after defeating all of Ogura's children, Starfy and Mo arrive at the castle Ogura created, setting out to stop him once and for all, again. Except, uh-oh, it seems like he's grown stronger, nearly putting an end to Starfy if not for the prince being saved at the last minute by Old Man Lobber, the lobster who served as the tutorial character for both games. As it turns out, Old Man Lobber is unbelievably strong, actually being the one who originally imprisoned Ogura many years ago alongside Starfy's father. While now in his old age he's not as strong, Old Man Lobber still puts up a fight, clashing with Ogura in an intense battle and driving him off to save Starfy. Definitely not something I expected out of a Game Boy Advance game. Anyways though, now more determined than ever, Starfy sets out again, defeating Ogura's normal, round, and final forms a second time and saving the day. But hold on, if this game's anything like the first, what lore would be revealed in the second staff credits this time? Well, let me tell you, it's even sadder. Once again focusing on Mo's backstory, this time the second staff credits show Mo's childhood. As a kid, he had a very happy family, but unfortunately over time, his parents would start to fight more and more, since his father refused to help Mo's mother raise their children, instead preferring to go out for golf or sit in front of the TV. Then, with their marriage degrading further with constant arguments, Mo's father would kick the family out of the house, leaving Mo, his mother, and 3 younger siblings homeless. And when they did find a house, it wouldn't be much at all, barely qualifying as a shack. Even then, however, Mo's mother would try to make the best of it, raising all 4 kids on her own. The problem was, even though she tried her best, Mo's mother would become gravely ill, eventually passing away right next to her devastated children. As a result, as the 4 kids now found themselves alone in the world, a still mourning Mo would take responsibility as the oldest sibling to raise its 2 brothers and sister, the second staff credits from the first game taking place after the events of this one. Like, wow man, for the kind of cutesy game Starfy is, they really didn't have to go that hard with Mo's backstory. But at the same time, I'm immensely glad they took that direction. For one, it makes Mo all the more compelling as a character, and it makes me glad that despite going through trauma that massive, through adventuring with Starfy, he's managed to bring his family back to normalcy. But like I said with the first game, it's not over yet, as we still have one more Starfy game in the Game Boy Advance trilogy. The Legendary Star Fe2, once again only releasing a year after the previous game, would prove to be another quality sequel, providing enough additions to stand out from the previous 2, mainly since now Starfy has a sister named Starly, who joins him and Mo on their adventure this game. Unlike Starfy, she has access to special new abilities like wall jumping and crawling, with certain stages throughout the game having sections only accessible via Starly. And once you beat the game, you can switch between the 2 at will, diversifying the overall gameplay even more. Plus, on Starfy's side, if you start high enough, the shooting star becomes more powerful, being utilized to progress through certain stages and even at the end of the game. That being said, the core gameplay is about the same as its 2 predecessors, utilizing a mostly new set of vehicles occasionally in stages to accompany the usual gameplay. Well, except for World 8, where the gameplay for not one level, but every level in the world is Wario-centric, the Nintendo character just straight up dropping into the story and becoming friends with Starfy. That is, after punching Mo and Starly into oblivion. And as far as side content goes, it's the same situation, retaining everything except the photos, sadly, which were removed in this one. Aside from that, there's not much else to talk about gameplay-wise, the only other notable addition being multiplayer. But that's not the case when it comes to the game's story, because what with this being the last game in the trilogy, it wraps things up really well. Starting off with a bang, the third Starfy takes no time at all to get into it, the game literally opening up with Puff Top and turmoil again. Except unlike before, it isn't Ogura's doing. Instead, the game shows an ominous, goopy figure who, once learning that Ogura had still not conquered Puff-Top for him, releases a storm to ravage Puff-Top and set Ogura free, permanently breaking the pot he was contained in. So of course, after taking the time to taunt Starfy, Ogura escapes Puff-Top again, Starfy and his friends close behind him. The thing is, unlike before where Ogura immediately began causing havoc in the ocean after escaping, this time he was ignoring it all, rushing away to some unknown location. You see, as it's explained over the course of the game, ever since Ogura was young, he had been in service of an entity literally named Evil, and taking Evil's orders out of fear, Ogura had been trying to conquer Puff-Top for some time, failing with every attempt, as we all know. Well, from here on, Ogura becomes much more than the one-dimensional villain he'd been made out to be in the first two games. For one, on his journey back to Evil, he spotted some pots belonging to a character in the game, and immediately destroyed them in a fit of anger, what with them bringing back the awful memories of him being trapped inside one. And in another scene, when he sees a character and their kids, Ogura gets reminded of his children, who are all revealed to have actually died after being defeated by Starfy in the previous game. It's pretty heavy stuff that's dropped out of nowhere, bits of Ogura's journey being revealed as you get closer to Evil. Though we'll get back to Ogura in a bit. Returning to Starfy and friends, while on their adventure, Starly comes across a mysterious elderly clam. It's soon being revealed that the green clam is actually Mo's absent father, the same one whose actions led to the eventual death of Mo's mother. As a result, Mo wasn't very pleased seeing his dad again, not getting along with him in the slightest. The thing is, even throughout it all, Mo's father still cared for his son, and later on, once the gang reached Evil's castle, having noticed their presence, Evil struck Mo with a lightning bolt, the attack nearly being fatal if not for Mo's father jumping in front of the attack to save his son, barely surviving the bolt and passing away shortly after. And even though Mo's relationship with his dad had been extremely complicated, he'd still mourn him all the same, bursting into tears alongside Starfy and Starly. Like hell, if this scene is this sad just by interpreting it from what's shown on screen and what few details about the story I could find online, I can't even imagine how sad it'd be with the dialogue translated. To make things even more depressing, the treasure you get from that level is a dog Mo's now deceased dad used to care for. Starfy 3 seriously does not play around. And it doesn't end there. Continuing Ogura's arc, after he finally arrived at Evil's castle, Evil was very displeased, telling Ogura off for his countless failures. However, despite all of that, Evil would give Ogura one last chance, bestowing Ogura some of his own power to defeat Starfy. In turn, once Starfy reaches the end, Ogura looks far different than he used to, now being far stronger and utilizing different attacks. Of course, he'd still end up defeated, but after his defeat, it's revealed Evil can't even be defeated by normal means, and to permanently stop him, Starfy needs the 42 evil crystals as they're the source of his power. So one fetch quest through all the new levels unlocked later, the finale of the game is now fully accessible, and let me tell you, things actually become hard now. Like, I'll readily admit, if you're playing Starfy for difficult gameplay, you're playing it for the wrong reasons. But with Starfy 3 in particular, it took me slightly over an hour to beat the final portion, Ogura becoming far stronger after you've collected the crystals, and Evil himself at first not seeming that bad, but becoming crazy once you hit his second form. I swear, there's this portion where you have to stop a massive energy blast by attacking certain points, and honestly, I have no idea how you'd even do that on a Game Boy Advance of all things. It's a final boss truly fitting for the end of a trilogy, and what comes after wraps things up even more so, because once Evil's second form is defeated, Evil still survives, taunting Starfy since he's apparently missing one of the evil crystals needed to defeat him for good. Though not all hope is lost, as coming to the rescue is none other than Ogura, using the last bit of his strength to give Starfy the evil crystal that gave him power, destroying the master he despised so much. The thing is, as Starfy soon realized, Ogura had sacrificed himself in the process, the once antagonist revealing that after fighting with Starfy for so long, his heroism and kindness had moved him, changing the villain's very ideals. And after apologizing for everything he'd done, Ogura let Starfy know how lucky he was to have such great friends and family before passing away, much to the grief of his former rivals. Like wow, Starfy 3 really is just the depression game of the series. But now, with Evil finally vanquished, Starfy had saved the day again, this time for good, the citizens of Puff-Top celebrating and the game ending with Mo having a picnic with his family, giving a toast to all the characters who died over the course of the trilogy. If that isn't the perfect way to end a storyline, I don't know what is. Even though Starfy 3 would sell a bit less than the second game, I'd without hesitation say it's the best of the three, combining fantastic gameplay with a story I found emotional even though I barely had any translations of it. If anything, the game definitely gives off the impression that it was planned to be the final Starfy game, except with the franchise's continued success in Japan, our favorite little star thing was gonna make the jump to the Nintendo DS. Released in 2006, 2 years after the third Starfy game, the Legendary Starfy 4 would come out on the still fresh Nintendo DS. Once again, like the past game, still not receiving any localization in the West. But unlike the past games, Starfy 4 would change things quite a bit, the most notable being the obvious graphical upgrade accompanying the jump to a new console. Now, instead of everything being 2D, the game incorporated 3D elements, mainly in the backgrounds of levels, though I did like how in each different world, the top screen showed off a 3D model of the world, while the bottom screen had a 2D interactable one. And on the topic of levels, let's talk about the game's progression, as Starfy 4 would be the first game in the series to change it. Whereas in the previous three, a lot of the game consisted of you going through levels and helping out the characters in them, now the characters and stages are separate. Starfy first talking to the character in need, and then gaining access to the level that quest corresponds to. Plus, instead of levels having a beginning and an end, now they're more of an assortment of rooms, the game placing markers by where quests want you to go, so that once you're there, you can easily just return to the start. At least, that's how the game progresses for your first run. Once you have to go around getting this game's collectibles, the answer cards, to unlock the true ending, it does become more like the previous games. And that's another thing, the answer cards. Unlike before, where extra stages were immediately accessible after getting the first ending, Starfy 4 uses a riddle system, each answer card providing more possible answers to the riddles needed to enter the extra stages. It's a mechanic I found to be really unique, and man, would it have been great if I'd actually understood what the riddles were even saying. I've said it before and I'll say it again. For the love of everything, please, someone translate these games. But anyways, progression aside, other aspects of Starfy's gameplay would also receive notable changes, mainly concerning the health bar and the newly implemented SP bar. Rather than using the set number of hit points allotted to both Starfy and bosses alike, the fourth game changes it to an upgradable health bar, Starfy's health going as high as 250 hit points. To accommodate this, so the game wouldn't become brain dead easy, bosses would be tweaked with this in mind, some attacks hurting Starfy more than others, especially towards the end of the game. And with the new SP bar, as you progress through the game, Starfy and Starly receive 4 new abilities, one exclusive to Starly and another exclusive to Starfy. While the first two are more for support, one healing a character and another having a chance to turn all enemies into pearls, the other two function as direct gameplay mechanics, helping out during bosses or specific levels when they're needed. In my opinion, both additions were pretty neat, the latter serving to differentiate between Starfy and Starly further, the game also improving Starly with the addition of the low spin. Oh, and before I forget, let's talk side content, as while the game would be the first to not feature multiple minigames, the DS's capabilities would be put to full use with the newly improved Stuff feature. Now, when you dress up Starfy or Starly, it's a 3D model of them instead of a 2D sprite, leading to some pretty great combinations and some, well, borderline monstrosities. That's enough on the game's gameplay though. What about its story? Well, rather than the conflict taking place on Pufftop, Starfy 4's story goes to the Ami Kingdom, where recently, after being rejected by the Prince of the Kingdom, an evil eel named Djil stole the kingdom's treasure, using its power to both conquer the land and make herself more beautiful so that Prince Coral would love her. And parallel to that, in order to save the kingdom, a young girl named Maddle managed to escape to Pufftop, pleading for Starfy's help with defeating Djil. So then, the new adventure begins, with Starfy falling for Maddle and Starly falling for the aforementioned prince over the course of their journey. And once the group makes it to Djil, the game's final boss is definitely more on the unique side, what with the second phase literally taking place inside her mouth. Plus, whereas the final phase isn't as insane as Evil's was, it's definitely a bit unsettling, Starfy removing parts of Djil's mask to defeat her. After that, once Starfy put a stop to Dajil, the group realizing that the reason Prince Coral rejected her was due to her personality, not looks, Starfy and Starly become heartbroken as it's revealed Madeline and Prince Coral were already engaged before the game's events. Starfy 4 ending on their marriage as Starfy and Starly look on watching their crushes become engaged. Overall, the Legendary Starfy 4 is a solid entry in the series, not being my favorite one exactly, but still pretty good, especially as the franchises jump to the DS. And now, with the 4 Japan-only games covered, there's only one more Starfy game to talk about, the one that probably got you to click on this video, Starfy 5, otherwise known as the Legendary Starfy. Coming out a full 6 years after the first game, the Legendary Starfy would be the first and only game in the series as of this video to ever be localized in English. And for me and many others, it'd be how most people got to know Starfy, I myself getting the game when it came out back when I was 9. The question is, if Nintendo deemed the first 4 Starfy games to be not fit for American audiences, what was so different about the 5th game? Well, quite a bit as it turns out. You see, from as early as the game's planning, Starfy 5 was pretty much engineered to be fit for localization, making sure people could pick it up without knowledge of the previous 4 games. Even then though, Starfy 5 wasn't really devoid of references to Japanese culture, one of the largest examples being the game's best minigame, Dumpling Master, where you have to make as much takoyaki as possible within the time limit. If I had to guess, the reason only Starfy 5 was brought over was probably due to Nintendo shifting its views on what's localizable and what isn't, meaning if the Starfy games had just come out a bit later, there's a pretty good chance the rest of the world would have seen the series. It's not like Starfy wasn't important to Nintendo. Up until then, the company had even snuck Starfy into other games, sometimes as an Easter egg and other times as even more. But hey, at least we got one of them right. As a kid, it was a game I played to death, unlocking everything I could 2 times over, so needless to say I enjoyed it a lot. Though now, having the perspective of the entire series, how does the game truly stack up in comparison? Well, at least gameplay-wise, it's definitely just as fun, since you really can't go wrong with the base Starfy formula, especially with the new mechanics introduced in some of the levels, my personal favorite being a tie between the low gravity in space, or the levels where you have to avoid getting eaten by a massive shark, more of the level actually being hidden inside of it if you do get eaten, which now that I think about it, definitely seems to be an ongoing theme when it comes to Starfy games. And rather than bringing back the first 4's vehicle function, Starfy 5 would consolidate the concept into Starfy's transformations, a gimmick that ended up being one of the game's main selling points. Plus, somewhat going back to basics, the HP and SP bars from the 4th game would be removed, Starfy 5 adopting the heart meter from the first 3, the only difference being you can now upgrade it, much like how it worked in 4. However, one thing I did notice playing Starfy 5 now is compared to the previous games, it has far fewer characters than any entry in the franchise, the 3-hour-long original even having more. Whether or not this was done to make the game more accessible outside of Japan, who can really say? But at least for me, it definitely takes some of the charm away from the game and knowing how the others are. Granted, there are still levels that function like the older games where you have to help a character out to progress, but unlike before, they aren't a constant, with the characters that do make an appearance showing up more frequently to make up for it. Plus, while a few recurring characters do come back in Starfy 5, a noticeable amount of them that had persisted from the first game all the way until the 4th would be left out of the 5th, most likely once again for the sake of localization. Though what doesn't really make much sense localization-wise is Starfy 5's removal of recurring songs and segments in the series. For example, how in every game but the 5th, before fighting a boss, there'd always be a little dialogue from said boss. Like, it may have been completely unrelated to localization, but it definitely struck me as kind of odd. Anyways, let's move on. The lack of recurring aspects is definitely a bit disappointing, but it's not anything big enough to adversely affect the game, as on the other hand, Starfy 5 added comic-style cutscenes to accompany the story, a neat little addition that fit in well with the usual dialogue. And on that note, before we get to the story, let's touch on Starfy 5's side content, without a doubt my favorite side content in the series. All allocated to one menu, this time being Moe's case rather than his house. Like the previous game, the stuff feature returns, once again letting you dress up a 3D Starfy and Starly in all sorts of outfits, ranging from cutesy costumes to whatever whatever the hell that is. And when it comes to minigames, Starfy 5 knocks it out of the park, the fishing and takoyaki games being the ones I used to constantly play. Also, with the picture book function, Starfy 5 would turn it into a gacha game, adding an extra layer of fun to it. But in terms of new additions, there's the Mo Show, a mini talk show hosted by Mo interviewing the game's characters, with more interviews being unlocked as he progressed further in the story. Looking at it now, it does have a few kinda glaring translation errors, though I still enjoyed it a ton. So now, with everything else covered, let's touch on Starfy 5's story. One day, far away from Pufftop, the planet Banera was attacked by vicious space pirates, led by a power-hungry dragon named Mashtooth, attacking the planet so he could absorb the powers of its inhabitants. And among all the Banerans living there, the strongest was Prince Bunston, the leader of the planet, as both of his parents had died when he was young. The problem was, Bunston was still a kid, so since he couldn't fight Mashtooth, he'd have to escape the planet, crash landing on the planet Pufftop's on. The thing is, after crash landing, Bunston developed amnesia, immediately escaping Pufftop and prompting Starfy and Mo to follow him, thus starting the adventure. In turn, after becoming friends with Bunston, it's revealed he has the power to shapeshift with Starfy, the Baneran prince remembering more transformations as his amnesia goes away. Then, one long adventure later, and a rock-paper-scissors battle too, the group finally reaches Mashtooth, the space pirate drunk on Baneran power, almost consuming Bunston whole, if not for some of his underlings you'd fought earlier betraying him and saving the prince. But unfortunately, it's too late, as with the power he'd already obtained from Bunston, Mashtooth transforms into what I like to call the Thumb Destroyer, since after a pretty crazy battle in space, Mashtooth throws the actual moon at Starfy, leading to the most nightmarish button masher of my childhood. Of course, now as an adult, it's not very hard anymore, but when I was younger, this part was the bane of my existence. If I remember correctly, I'm pretty sure I never even beat this part myself, having to rely on an older friend to complete it for me. So then, with an aching hand as your reward, Mashtooth gets annihilated by the same moon he threw at you, all the power he stole from the Banerans returning to them. However, that's not the end of Starfy 5, as after beating Mashtooth, Pufftop becomes a bonus world, fleshing out Starly's side of the story as she defends the kingdom and fights a familiar foe. And after that, if you complete the game and beat the boss rush, another bonus world gets unlocked, featuring challenge levels based on previous worlds and a surprise fight with none other than Old Man Lobber, apparently the strongest being in the franchise, and if I'm being perfectly honest, the only really challenging boss in the 5th Starfy game. Not to mention, before fighting Super Saiyan Lobber, he actually mentions Ogura, this being pretty much one of the only references in the 5th game to the previous 4. As my final verdict on the game, while I wouldn't say it's the best in the series, Starfy 5 still holds up from when I played it as a kid, admittedly not being the most challenging thing in the world, but still featuring that colorful Starfy charm. And well, there you have it, the Legendary Starfy, the only game in the series to ever be localized and the last game ever made in the series. So now we're here, and if you're anything like me, there's only one question on your mind. Where has Starfy been for the past 12 years? Well, I can kind of answer that. You see, unfortunately, after the release of Starfy 2, every consecutive entry in the series continued to sell worse in Japan. And while the 5th game would actually do alright in the US, selling over double of what it did in Japan, its lackluster reception in its home country didn't do it any favors. Plus, on top of that, Starfy's developers are also kind of on the unique side, the platformer being the product of a partnership between Tosei and Nintendo, the former rarely ever putting their name on games they work on, more so being a ghost developer of sorts, having a hand in now over 1,000 games, most of the time not even putting their staff in the credits of games they help out with. When it comes to Starfy, it's kind of an anomaly with the company more than anything, so if I had to guess, that on top of the game not doing well in Japan probably led to work ending on the series, which honestly is really a shame, as to date, I've never really seen another game capture the feel of a Starfy title quite as well. Like, at least translate the games that only came out in Japan. If fans are willing to do it for free, there's clearly a demand for them to be localized. And on that note, if this video manages to get any traction, please, if you or someone you know has experience translating Japan-only games, do bring Starfy to their attention. They're wonderful games, and I'm sure countless people will be grateful to be able to understand the earlier entries. games. Since my personal favorite is Starfy 3, being able to understand all that dialogue would be a blessing. And hey, if after watching this you feel like trying the games out, I'll link the English patch to the first game in the description. I'm confident you'll enjoy it. Though now, all that being said, let's bring things to a close. Without a doubt, when looking at the infinite sea of platformers, Starfy will always stand out among the rest. And hopefully, after making this video, maybe he won't be as underrated. Hey you, that's right, you. Before I get to the outro, real quick I want to ask, what videos would you guys like to see from me? As I'm kinda rebuilding my channel from near death at the moment and returning to uploading more frequently, I figured why not ask the fans who stuck with me and didn't leave despite all the content droughts. I'll be reading the comments, so leave your suggestions there. Oh, and my Twitter works too if you prefer that. Anyways, if you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, do subscribe. And today's cool thing of the day is Pokemon Conquest. Having played just about every Pokemon spin-off on the DS, I've been curious about Pokemon Conquest for some time now. Well, needless to say, it's definitely worth it, essentially combining Pokemon elements with a tactical game. Who knows, maybe you'll even see me make a video on it in the future, though I first have to beat the game. Anyways though, here's today's Twitch clip.
Look up.
Look up?
Yeah, just look up and you'll see it's over.
Wait. Whoa, oh, I will join them. I will join them.
Oh my god!
Oh,
They just keep going!
I'm joining them. I will add on to the tower. So that being said, I'm the RPG Monger, and don't forget that each and every one of you are fantastic.